Hey everybody, and welcome to Dominion Cards. This is a video series where we take a strategic, in-depth look at various cards from the board game Dominion. Today we're looking at Militia. This is a 4-cost action and attack from the base game. It says, +2 coins, each other player discards down to 3 cards in hand. So Militia is a pretty powerful attack. The attack is what we call a non-stackable attack. So every time you play it, your opponent goes down to 3 cards in hand. If you play it a second time that turn, then your opponent, who's already at 3 cards in their hand, they're not going to do anything. So although you still get the 2 coins for a second play, the actual attack part isn't doing anything on successive plays. So usually you're only looking to really play 1 Militia every turn. It's worth noting with the attack that this is not that your opponent starts with a random 3-card hand. Your opponent does get to basically choose the best 3 cards of their hand to keep, and that is relevant sometimes. But it's just a quick overview. So Militia, it costs 4. This means that you can open with it in one of your 2 starting turns. Militia is a very good card to open with. It's actually really strong early on. So something that's really important in Dominion is to decide whether or not you want to hit 5 as soon as possible. So 5 is a really important price point. There's lots of very good cards at 5, and also your starting deck isn't that great at hitting 5. So usually if you want to hit 5 straight away, you're going to be looking to gain cards that are either generate you money or that give you a little bit of draw. Now Militia gives you 2 coins when you play it, so that's great for you hitting 5. But the other thing is that the coppers at that stage of the game are really important for your economy, and you really do need them to hit 5 when you're starting deck. So Militia discarding, making you discard coppers, can actually seriously dent your ability to hit 5 early on. So Militia helps you hit 5, and it also prevents your opponent from hitting 5, and depending on how important it is to hit 5, this can be super critical. So Militia can be really critically important to open in one of your 2 starting turns. It really is a strong card in that regard. A quick note about first player advantage. So being a turn-based game, Dominion generally has a little bit of first player advantage. The player who goes first is more likely to win. Militia is an example of a card that has a pretty significant first player advantage. I think the stats show over numerous games that in games with Militia, the first player's likelihood of winning is quite high. I think it's nearly 60% or something. It's for 1 card to make that big of a difference is actually pretty big. Now, attacks in general tend to benefit the earlier players in turn order. That's generally just because their effects tend to impact the player sooner, the opponent. But when you consider attacks like, for example, a junking attack, when they put a curse in your discard, you usually have to wait until you've shuffled and that curse enters your discard before you draw it, and it actually starts to impact you. But Militia hits you straight away. So the effect happens right now, and the earlier turns in Dominion are definitely the more important turns. So getting impacted and having your turns be made worse really quickly and early on is a lot more critical. So that's just another reason why Militia is so important. But it's what you're really looking as first player, you kind of want to play Militia on turn 3 or 4. Those are the critical turns where you want to try and get a 5-cost card, because you're going to buy it and it's going to go into your discard pile, and you're going to shuffle that in so that from turn 5 onwards you get to play with it. Now, if you're player 1 and you draw the Militia on turn 3 or 4, you hit your opponent and potentially stop them getting a 5 before that shuffle at the end of turn 4 and at the start of turn 5. But if you are player 2 and you draw Militia on turn 4, then your opponent, player 1, they've already shuffled in. They've had that chance to get an early 5, and they've already shuffled anything they've bought into their deck. So it's a lot worse for you to draw Militia on turn 4. So the likelihood that player 1 stops player 2 from getting that critical 5-cost card early on is way higher than the likelihood of player 4 stopping player 1 from getting it. And that's sort of why Militia has such a big first player advantage to it. You normally still get it anyway, in spite of this, if you are player 2, but it is something to just be aware of regarding Militia, that it really, really benefits player 1 quite a lot. Now, the attack itself, what is sort of impact is discarding down to 3 cards in hand having for you. So obviously you can do less in a 3-card hand in general. If you cannot draw your hand up from 3 to 5, then the discard attack is actually pretty, particularly strong. It's especially strong against decks that are just buying the basic treasures a lot, like silver and gold. If you think about what we call a big money strategy that is generally just trying to buy lots of silvers and golds, if you want to hit 8, then there's a couple of ways to do that, but a lot of them involve having more than 3 cards. So if you have gold, gold, silver, or gold, 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 then you'll hit 8. But there's other ways to hit 8 that include gold, silver, silver, copper, or gold, silver, copper, 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 or 4 silvers, or 3 silvers and 2 coppers, and so on and so on. But you'll see that there's not really very many of those combinations that work with only 3 cards. So Militia really strongly impact big money style decks. It crushes them pretty easily. If you can play Militia every turn against someone trying to go big money, they're going to have a real bad time of it. They have to have such a high density of golds in their deck that it takes them so long to do that. So if you see Militia on the board, you really want to avoid doing some sort of big money thing, which usually you want to avoid anyway, but you especially want to avoid it with Militia. If you have the ability to draw your deck, then by discarding 2 cards at the start of your turn, if you wanted to still play those cards this turn, you have to draw them again. So even if you are drawing your deck, Militia just adds that little bit of extra. You need to draw a little bit more. It just adds a bit more draw that the player needs if they want to get everything. Sometimes you have a hand that's really good and then you're hit by Militia, and that means that you might have to discard some draw, and what that can do is that can just make it more difficult still to draw your whole deck, because you don't get to play those cards. They come at the end, right, which is the time when you don't want them. So watch out with that Militia. Just it's reason why it's so strong. It's overall very good because it impacts all sorts of decks. Some are better than others, but Militia generally 3-card hands are much worse than having a 5-card hand. So let's say Militia's on the board, your opponent's probably getting it because it's really good. So what can you do about that? Well, something that new players tend to think about is a card like Moat, right? Hey, it protects you against attacks. If you have a lot of moats, you don't have to discard. But the thing you've got to watch out for with Moat is that Moat itself is not a very good action card. If you weren't actually planning to play that Moat, then by getting it as a defense just for Militia, you've basically added a bad card to your hand anyway. So you were kind of already only playing with a 4-card hand. Obviously, if you are using the Moat, maybe, for example, it's the only draw card, then, that's fine. You just happen, if you have it in your hand, great, the Militia doesn't impact you. But generally, you tend to find that people do not buy Moat just to prevent a 5-card hand from being discarded down to a 3-card hand. That's not a very good use of Moat. So what you really want to do with Militia is that you want to be able to draw your hand back up again very easily. So Militia really, really encourages you to build a good, reliable deck that can draw a lot. It's good when you do that, not only because you can play your militia every turn against your opponent, but also, as we know, as we explained, militia just like crushes big money style boards anyway. So you sort of it's a great card for basically telling everyone they've got to build a good engine on this board. It slows the game down a lot, so you have a little bit more time to build a good engine. So cantrip cards that have +1 card, +1 action, if you have a lot of those in your hand, sometimes they can make it difficult to decide what cards you want to discard when you're hit with a militia attack, because each cantrip sort of represents like some unknown random card in your deck after you've played it. So you have to decide, are the cards in your hand, like the ones that you already have, are they better than some random other card in your deck or not? So it could be a bit vague. You don't know, like if that cantrip ends up drawing you like a province, then it's like, hey, actually you would have been better off just discarding the cantrip. But, you're not really sure what it's going to do. On the other hand, cantrips that generate you money, despite being that, they let you sort of do more with a lower hand size. They let you generate more income despite not having very many cards in your hand. So it can be nice to get a bunch of those, like markets, for example, just so that you can play a bunch and then, hey, you've generated more money despite not having many cards to play with. Having said that, Poacher isn't very good. There are some cards that really don't like having small hand sizes, so like Seller is an obvious one. Poacher, if it starts needing to discard cards, it's really bad, because every time you play it, your hand is also decreasing. So you just got to consider that. Like some cards are particularly bad with small hands, and you really want to avoid them if you think you're going to get hit by militia quite a lot. Draw to X cards. So some cards like Library in the base game, these are what we call draw to X, and that means that they tell you to draw up to a certain number of cards in hand. So Library says that you keep drawing cards until you have 7 in your hand. Now, Militia discarding you down to 3 means that when you play the Library, it's actually going to draw you more. So if you are able to play Library and you're hit with Militia, you might be able to discard some treasures or estates, which are the sort of cards that Library really doesn't like to have in your hand, because they sort of, they stop you from drawing more with future libraries as well. And you basically get to draw more from that library and ideally like replace that copper and that estate or whatever with something that was hopefully better. So Library can be sort of a counter against Militia. Library in the base game is sort of unusual in that it's a very, very like strong draw to X. A lot of draw to X cards do not draw up to 7. They tend to draw less, like up to 6 or up to 5, or even like up to 4 in some cases. So, the fact that Library happens to be in the same expansion as Militia means that the draw to X against Militia is probably slightly better. In this case, like it sort of feels like a better counter than draw to X might usually be against Militia. But, that it doesn't necessarily counter Militia. It can do, but, you have to consider that the Militia might not be paid every turn, or it might be that it forced you to still discard good cards anyway. But generally, I would say that Militia becomes less important once you've got Library. Now, it's funny that when you are playing a deck with a Library, Militia can be quite nice, because if you've got a bunch of spare actions, you play Militia, your hand size has gone down because it's not drawing any other cards, and your own libraries then get to draw a little bit more. And generally, you might end up having a Militia left over from the early game anyway, like if it's still really important to hit like Sentry early on or something. So it doesn't necessarily change how you play, but it could be a card that eventually you want to stop playing if your opponent goes all in on like Festival and Library, because you might end up actually helping them on some of their turns. That's just something you need to keep in mind. There exist some cards, I'm not going to go through them all with examples because there's a bunch that kind of like you to discard cards from your hand. They give you some sort of benefit when you discard them. It can be tempting to think that this is great. If your opponent buys Militia, you just counter their Militia with those cards. But actually getting those cards into your hand at the start of in your starting hand is not necessarily all that reliable or easy to do. So a lot of the time, they will play Militia and you won't have those cards in your hand. And so it didn't really work out. Generally, those sorts of cards like you to draw your deck first and then specifically have discard cards to discard those particular cards. But it is something to think about. You might want to consider that you might be able to take advantage of the discard in some unusual cases. Lastly, while we talked about big money being real bad, sometimes you just have Militia on a board where there's no real way to draw more cards. Maybe there's terminal draw, but there's no village, or there's just no draw card at all. In that case, you are going to have a real long, slow game where Militia's just really powerful. So you're going to want to get a bunch of Militias, and to play around that, you might simply just have to realise that you're going to be having these bad turns a lot, and therefore you need to play a deck that is expecting to have a lot of bad hands. So if you consider buying gardens or duchies or estates a lot more often from a lot earlier on, you are more likely to end up drawing a starting hand that's got 2 victory cards in it, and then when your opponent hits you with Militia, it didn't really matter because you just discard the victory cards that you weren't going to play anyway, and you sort of built your deck kind of expecting that you were only really going to be having 3 useful cards in your deck every turn anyway. So that can be a way to deal with Militia, is just to... I don't want to say to deliberately play a bad deck, but sometimes you take advantage of the fact that the game is just going to go real long, right? And you just buy these, what we call slogger decks, right? Decks where it's just yep, this is a super long game, so we're just going to buy this deck that can't really achieve very much, but aims to just amass a whole load of points over time. And just, you're never going to hit province, right? You just sort of build to say, okay, I'm just not going to take any provinces and try and win the game another way. One notable interaction, because it's also in the base game, is Council Room. Council Room, each time you play it, your opponent draws a card. So if you're playing multiple Council Rooms, they can have a 7 or an 8 card hand to start their turn. But if you can then play Militia at the end of your turn, you force them to drop all the way back down to 3, so they end up discarding way more cards from the attack. Now, admittedly, they do have more cards to pick from, so you can still increase your opponent's reliability, just they're more likely to draw their own Council Rooms and villages together, starting from an 8-card hand. And this is also a situation where you would buy a moat just to counter Militia, because it's a lot easier to find a moat in your hand and have it not hurt you if you start each turn with an 8-card hand or a 7-card hand, right? So that's just something to keep in mind. You can sort of use Militia to get around the fact that Council Room can help your opponent. So it's just a nice combo there. Some cards let you start your turn with more cards. This sounds good at first with Militia. So there are some cards, like duration cards. So I've got an example of Wharf down here, where the card actually draws you more cards at the start of your next turn. So you get hit with Militia, you discard down to 3. And then if you played a Wharf last turn, at the start of your turn, you immediately draw 2 and you sort of back up at 5. So that could be really nice to try and sort of get around the effects of Militia. I mean, it's still a good effect to have anyway, even if you weren't hit by Militia, but it's sort of easier to start doing more stuff. Obviously, if you draw a lot at the start of your turn and you get back up to a reasonable hand size. But there are some other types of ways to add cards to your hand, and usually these are ways that aren't done via duration cards. So there's an event in Adventures called Expedition here that says that you draw 2 extra cards for your next hand. And what that means is that at the end of your turn, instead of drawing a hand of 5 that you sit with until your next turn, you end up having a hand of 7 or 9, and that gives Militia the opportunity to hit you and basically discard all the way back down to 3, and then you start your next hand with 3. So Militia's pretty good against those. The reason why they do these differently is because the duration cards give you a reminder to do it at the start of your next turn, because Dominion is mainly a physical board game first and foremost. It has to try and come up with ways to make you not forget what you bought last turn. So duration cards let you draw at the start of your next turn, but events ask you to do it at the end of your previous turn, just so that you don't forget. That's why there's a difference, and the difference really matters in this case with cards like Militia. Trashing. So something like, let's say it's a board that's got Chapel on it. Normally with Chapel, this is really, really strong trashing. What you want to do is when you draw Chapel into your hand, you trash, ideally, 4 starting cards that you had in your hand. Militia is a pretty good opening with Chapel, because if you play your Militia on a turn where your opponent drew their Chapel, what happens is that Chapel can now only trash 2 cards instead of 4. So you can seriously slow down your opponent's ability to trash by playing a Militia. Now, of course, if you draw your own Chapel and Militia together, then you'd rather trash than play the Militia, but sometimes that can really matter. Cathedral is like another project from Renaissance that it forces you to trash a card at the start of your turn, every turn. So if you start with a 3-card hand, you're forced to trash down to a 2-card hand, and sometimes that can be really bad. Sometimes you still get it anyway, but really, really strong trashes, cards that trash a whole bunch from your hand, they can be impacted by Militia, especially because you want to trash early and you can buy Militia early. But there are some trashes which Militia just doesn't impact at all. So if you consider trashes that trash 2 cards from your hand, so Steward from Intrigue is one, and Ambassador from Seaside is one. Ambassador is not really trashing, but you basically treat it like trashing. If you played Steward on a 5-card hand, you trash 2 starting cards, you might end up therefore just having 2 coppers left over, and it might be that you don't want to buy anything with that turn. So you play Steward, you trash 2 cards, you end your turn. Well, if you got hit with Militia, those 2 coppers that you just weren't playing anyway, they get discarded, and it makes absolutely no difference at all. So Militia doesn't really do that much against cards like Steward or Ambassador, because your opponent just wasn't planning to use the cards that they end up discarding anyway. So just note the difference there between the different ways that cards can get trashed early and whether or not Militia does anything about it. With cards like Sentry, I guess, it cannot trash cards from your hand, so if you drew curses into your starting hand, Militia can be a way to discard those curses, and then they're prime material for Sentry to trash later if they can draw the rest of their deck in time. So, that's a pretty niche thing, but noting how Militia tends to impact certain trashers or not. Obviously, if your opponent is buying Steward and they're not really hitting 5 early on and they're just trashing, Militia is a lot less important, because those early turns where you're trying to, you're not planning to hit 5, so that's what Militia's good against. So that sort of severely reduces the impact of Militia. That's sort of what I was trying to get at with this slide. Now, normally with attacks, like I did last time, just a quick note on if you're playing with more than 2 players. So, Militia, because it can be played more often, what you find when you play Militia is that you might not actually be impacting every other player, because it's a non-stackable attack. So if 2 players on the table are able to play Militia every turn, then everybody will always be starting with 3 cards in their hand. So that can sort of disincentivize you to get your own Militia. If the militiaing is already covered by other players, you might decide that actually you want to start spending that terminal action space on something else, right? You don't really need to play the Militia because you're not really getting any sort of useful attack out of it, because someone else already has you covered. But as always with attacks, when you've got more than 2 players, you're going to get hit by it more often. So if in 4-player, it is possible that you are just going to get hit every single turn, and you're always going to have 3-card hands, and that would be the case even if your opponents aren't drawing their deck every turn. So you want to try, that's going to affect how you play the game and what sort of deck you go for. Engines are normally a lot more difficult to play the more players you have, sometimes because the game is actually shorter, like it is in 4-player, but also because there's less engine component cards to go around between players. So you may realise that means that you just can't draw your deck very well, because all the villages and the smithies are just going to go as everyone's trying to buy them. So you may decide that therefore the best thing to do is to just go for more of a slog style game. In that case, you just think, 4-player, you can't engine very well, so you're just going to go for the get a load of victory cards early and often and just not plan and hit province. But it's as always, it's hard to give very specific advice for multiplayer games that have more than 2 players, just because your opponents and what they do have such a big impact that you can't necessarily predict, and so it's hard to give strategy advice for those. But there's a little bit of some anyway. Things to consider in multiplayer games with Militia. So now it is time to go to the online client, and we're going to generate some boards base only that have Militia. Let's have a look at this board here. So what have we got going on? So do we want to hit 5 early? Yes. We have Sentry as the only trashing by the looks of it. So this is going to be really important. It's really important. So you definitely open Militia and probably Silver, I think. And you want to hit Sentry and stop your opponent. After that, are you doing a Festival Library engine, or are you just going to go Village Council Room or Village Smithy Throne Room? I think either way that you do it, Council Room's a little bit better, because now that you have the Militia, you can stop your opponent from drawing all the way. You reduce them back down to 3 cards in hand, so Council Room's quite nice. On the other hand, Festival Library also does well against a Militia. Your opponent hits you for 3, and it sort of makes your library a little bit better. But I think it's possibly easier to end up getting double province turns by going for the Council Room. You thin down and you just draw big. Or maybe you just go Village Smithy and you don't worry about the reliability in this case, right? Village Smithy might be good enough anyway. But, you definitely, whichever strategy you go for, Militia's definitely doing a lot for you on this board. If your opponent goes Festival Library, you can just stop playing Militia. And if you go for Village Smithy, but if you go for Council Room to get that even better draw, and you need less draw cards, then you definitely just want to keep playing Militia no matter what your opponent's doing. So Militia's a big deal on that board. What have we got going on here? So the trashing is Moneylender and Remodel. So would you rather start with those? So Artisan. Is Artisan good here? There's no plus buy. The only way you're gaining extra cards is Remodel and Artisan. What are you going to be getting with Remodel? I guess you might be getting... You're probably okay with Poachers here, because there's not really an easy way to empty piles. Bandit looks like nice payload once you've trashed all of your coppers, so you definitely want some Village Smithy. Maybe you don't actually open Militia here. You want to start getting Moneylender. Do you want Moneylender to hit 6? Maybe if you could open Militia Silver and really hope to try and hit 6 to get Artisan and stop your opponent. But I don't think it's that important if you get hit, because you're fine to start getting Smithies and then some villages, and you're going to be using villages and smithies a bunch, and it's a lot easier to hit 6 after that. Like, I'm not sure militia is necessarily that big of a deal here. I think you still want one eventually, but maybe getting a moneylender or a remodel, probably even remodel in particular, like to start getting the engine components, and then you can start trashing your coppers later. Maybe you just want to focus on villages, smithies really early on. Of course, there is no buy, so maybe bandit's not as good as I said that I thought it might be, because you only really want to hit so much. Artisan is still good. It's the only way you're going to get like more than one victory card a little bit. Well, there's remodel, but you're going to use it to like pick up duchies eventually, but I don't think you're in that much of a rush. So I think militia is not a big deal here, and I may not get one. I think if I can start drawing my deck consistently, then I will get a militia, because I might as well. And it's a bit of money, and I'm going to need some money. I guess I don't. No, I do get a bandit because I want to remodel from the bandit, right? So I am still doing that. So I think I'm just focusing on getting these cards. Eventually that will help me to hit 6 when I'm like money lending coppers. But I just get it whenever I do. And militia is not something that I open with. I think there's better things to open with here. But I do get one eventually. It is eventually okay once my opponent just hurt my opponent's ability to draw their deck a little bit later on. It's rare to find a board where you don't actually get militia, to be fair. What's going on here? So, Throne Room is our only village. Is there cards we want that cost 5 a lot? Yes. Workshops, not so great. Moneylender, this is tricky. So Moneylender is the only trashing. We really want to trash those coppers, but we really want to get Witch first. There's no way to trash the curses that we get. So I think we open Militia because we really don't want our opponent to get Witch, and we want it as soon as possible. And then we want just a bunch of labs. We can eventually like Throne Room some labs as like a village effect, and we can start trashing down with Moneylender as well. Artisan is really nice if we can get that to pick up a load of laboratories. There's no buy here, so our draw only needs to be so good anyway, but we really want all the labs, and we want to witch our opponent a couple of times. So I think we definitely open Militia instead of Moneylender, and we get a silver, and if we hit 6, we're super happy. If we hit 5, then that's great for Witch. We start getting labs and the Throne Room, and we try to play like Throne Room on our 1 Witch, I think, rather than get a second Witch, and we just want to then try and get a load of labs as well. Eventually we will pick up a Moneylender once at some point, and we will start trashing the coppers just to give us a little bit more reliability, because the draw is not super great. We can throne the labs. I mean, it's okay, the draw. But yeah, Militia has a big impact on this board. We're definitely opening with it early. Yep, so that is Militia. So what's coming on next? So we've got Chapel for early trashing, and we've also got Sentry as well. There is no village on this board. So let's say we Chapel early. What are we going to do? Do we get a Militia and we basically try and hurt our opponent's Chapel? What do we do once we've trashed our deck? What's like the one? I think the one terminal we want to play every turn is actually a Militia. We still trash all of our cards. We get a Militia, and we want like a silver and a bunch of merchants. Is that really good? I think that's sort of the best that we can do. Now, Gardens is tempting, I guess, because our deck isn't very good. I think Sentry, however, is good enough to provide a little bit more reliability that actually we might still be able to try and go for the province. We get like 1 or 2 silvers, and we just buy a whole bunch of merchants, and we sort of try to go for that money generating cantrip despite only having a 3-card hand. I think that's going to be better than trying to do some sort of like library money or council room money after we've trashed down. Like, I just don't feel like that's necessarily going to be good enough, because really we still want to hit our opponent with Militia. It's just quite good here. But, because the trashing's real good, like, maybe the library is really good as well. Like, maybe... How good can it possibly be? But, like, once we start greening, like, the library really starts to stink. But at the same time, like, you are discarding, like, provinces from your hand if your opponent's playing Militia, and then you're drawing up quite a lot with library. Maybe the Militia is quite bad here. Like, maybe we want to... I still feel like you have to chapel either way. I do want some sentries in any case. I guess we do still buy the Militia early. It's the only sort of other thing we're going to be doing, along with the chapel. And then if our opponent starts picking up libraries, we might have some sentries, and we just look to trash the Militia, and we make our opponent's library deck like really stink, if that's what they do. Okay, so I think what you do is you have to go for like the playing a bunch of merchants and playing Militia, and if your opponent dares to get a library, you stop playing Militia, and then their draw is really bad because they've trashed down with chapel. I think if they don't trash and they start trying to go for like gardens, then you're fine to just keep playing like Militia. And I think it's really easy to do well with the merchant because you have, or maybe then in that case you just get a council room and a bunch of golds and silvers, and you just buy provinces really fast if they dare to try that. So I think Militia is still an opener here. I think what your opponent chooses to do in response to that is going to depend on whether you keep playing it or not. So this is a board where you need to really counteract your opponent, but you're trying to open Militia if you open 3-4. Last one. Let's see what we got here. So, are there any fives we want to open with early? Not really. These aren't great fives to get straight away. Artisan is nice because you've got market. It's going to gain you throne rooms. It's going to gain you... Yeah, market throne rooms pretty nice. That allows you to actually do a council room draw and then hit your opponent with Militia. There is no way to really trash your starting card, so you really kind of want to get that council room draw engine with Militia. So I think you open silver and Militia, and there's moats to... If your opponent does council room Militia, you might be able to get a moat in or two and try and have good turns with that, but I think it's still important enough that you do it. So you go Militia silver, you want to start getting, like, maybe you open with a council room first to try and hit 6, get the artisan to start playing a bunch of markets, and then you start getting throne rooms, and you're doing throne room market. You draw up a lot, you play Militia, and you might get a mine just to, instead of adding extra treasures, you just want to try and improve your starting coppers because you're not doing anything else with them, and you can use market to gain a bunch of merchants with the extra buys. I think that's what you do, and I think you're looking to play Militia every turn this game. It's quite important. If your opponent does the same with the council room, you might be able to stop the Militia hitting you if you're lucky. You don't want that many moats, but it's still worth trying to do it anyway. I think it's important that you do like the council room Militia thing here. So that's that kingdom. I think Militia was just generally strong here. I can't remember now if we actually took Militia every board. No, I think there was one kingdom where we didn't. But generally... So the base game tends not to have super great fives, most of all, but like especially as you start going into expansions and the fives get significantly better, Militia turns out to be very, very strong. So it's a card that usually you always want it, and you might even try to delay your trashing slightly just to try and stop your opponent hitting 5 by getting the Militia instead, because the 5's important. But it's just a nice attack. You want to play it on your opponent every turn you can. Anyway, that was that video. I hope that was enjoyable for you, and hope to see you next time. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.